Hi, welcome to another Counter-Apologetics segment with Jonathan M.S. Pearce, a tippling philosopher. This week I'm going to be looking at the subject of morality, specifically objective morality, espoused by apologists such as William Lane Craig. Such apologists often use arguments like this. Premise 1. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Premise 3, therefore God exists. And they use this to establish the grounding for morality in the person of God. One can disagree with this in many different ways, but often the apologist will attack atheistic moral standpoints, such as, for example, consequentialism or utilitarianism, which is a type of consequentialism, as not being properly grounded, not being properly objective, so on and so forth. Now, I'm going to twist this approach back on the apologist by looking at the moral value of the actions of God himself or herself, and show that, in fact, God is the ultimate consequentialist. That the value of God's actions are derived from the consequences of those actions. So just to give a little bit of background on morality, I'm going to skim over some vast tracts of moral discourse here, but someone like Immanuel Kant would say that there were categorical imperatives. This means that there were sort of objective laws, moral laws, which couldn't and shouldn't be broken. So, for example, it's bad to lie, it's morally bad to lie, and you just shouldn't lie, full stop. The consequentialist, on the other hand, derives the value of moral actions, i.e. whether they're good or bad, not on absolute laws, but on the consequences that those acts bring about. Now, you can value that in many different ways. I mean, the classic utilitarianism would try and give the most happiness to the most number of people, so on and so forth. But it doesn't really matter how you value that, just that the value is derived by the consequences of the action. Now, the problem for someone like Kant and the categorical imperative would be a good thought experiment, for example, is the inquiring murderer. So you're hiding some victims up in your loft, in your attic, and a murderer comes round, and the murderer says, do you know where Jim and Jane are? I would like to murder them. And you know they're in your attic upstairs. So what do? Do you lie to this guy and say, no, sorry, I don't know where they are? And in doing so save those two people, or do you like Kant might suggest, are you bound by a categorical imperative not to lie? So therefore tell the truth, tell the murderer where they are, and the murderer goes and kills them. So how do we derive the morality of lying or not lying in this context? And I would say, as a utilitarian myself, that I would derive the morality of those actions by the consequences. So I would lie and just say, sorry mate, but don't know where they are, and thereby would save those two people's lives. Now, in the case of God and the Bible, there are huge amounts of absolute laws. You know, there's 613 of them, mitzvah in the Old Testament. You have the Ten Commandments. You have all sorts of absolute moral imperatives. And you have all these apologists saying, well, God grounds morality. God, is a grounding of objective morality. And yes, we do need to argue and define objective morality. That's such a difficult term to define clearly, and I'm not going to have time to do that today. I just want to point towards the notion that one morally values God's actions not intrinsically, but by the consequences that they bring about. There is no apparent intrinsic value in the actions of God, as we shall see. So let's take something like Noah's flood, the Great Flood, for example. God isn't pleased with his own creation that he's designed and knew about in advance. So, and for some strange reason, he's really upset with them rather than being upset with himself. That aside, he realizes that mankind is pretty horrible and decides to kill everyone, and also all the animals, apart from 2 of each animal, and apart from 8 of the humans. Now, this whole holocaust of death, millions of animals, millions of humans, whole ecosystems destroyed, this intrinsically can't be a good thing. God has said, thou shalt not kill, and all these kind of absolute laws, and yet here God is willfully destroying whole tracts of nature and humanity. So he's either breaking his own absolute laws, or there must be some greater good that must come from this horrible evil. And apologists love to say this anyway. God moves in mysterious ways. Why is there cancer? Why is there murderers? Why are there hurricanes and tsunamis? Well, God moves in mysterious ways. There must be a greater good. It must all happen for a reason. Well, of course, in saying that, and in saying that the Great Flood had a greater good that underpins that horrible instance, means, of course, you are valuing that event, the morality of that event, by the consequences which come about from that event. So one would argue that the flood was necessary for this greater good to come about, for humanity to start again, for whatever reason that may be. It's not really that important what the reason is, but the fact is that the morality of that event is derived from the consequences. And an even more powerful example of this would be Jesus himself. Sacrificed, died, Romans, murdered, if you like, or sentenced to death, Jesus on a cross. This is obviously a horrible bit of suffering and death, but of course it's for a reason. It's for the atonement of sins. It's for a greater good, and even that the core of Christianity can be claimed to be a consequentialist ideal. So just a short segment today to point towards the fact that virtually all of these deaths in the Old Testament and the major death in the New Testament, these terrible instances, appear to be serving a greater good. What that greater good is it can be arguable, but the fact that these events do look to be justified by a later greater good means that God is a consequentialist. The objective morality of God seems to be somewhat on shaky grounds here, since the whole of the Old Testament and all the deaths therein are justified by the consequences of a greater good. Anyway, food for thoughts. Post your comments in the comment box on the Skepticule website. Forget to drop by my A Tippling Philosopher blog for a chat. Until next time, keep questioning.